Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, and welcome to another weekend book review. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
Okay, so bread.
Bread.
Who doesn't love bread, right?
Yeah.
A crusty baguette or a warm slice of sourdough.
Yeah.
But I bet you'd be surprised how much history is wrapped up in that simple loaf.
It really is fascinating.
We're diving deep into A History of Bread by Peter Scholliers today,
Okay.
focusing specifically on Belgium since the late 1700s.
Sounds good.
By the end of this, you'll look at your next loaf in a whole new light,
I think so.
like a window into social change and economic trends.
Yeah, great.
Even some surprising beliefs about health.
It's true. Bread has a fascinating story.
Like what?
For centuries, it wasn't just food.
Okay.
It was like deeply intertwined with life itself.
Okay.
The word bread was practically synonymous with livelihood or just sustenance, you know.
So it was more than just fuel. It was symbolic of something much bigger.
Exactly. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, experts considered bread to be almost a complete food. Like you could live on practically bread alone.
That's a far cry from what we think about nutrition today.
Yeah, that's for sure.
The book also mentions some pretty interesting medical beliefs about bread. Like something about the four humors.
Right, the four humors.
Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. So the four humors was this ancient Greek idea
Okay.
that went on for centuries.
Okay.
The body was made up of these four fluids: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile.
Okay.
And keeping them balanced was the key to good health. Different foods could influence these humors.
Okay.
And bread was seen as like a key player in maintaining that balance.
Really?
Yeah, for example, they thought rye bread could help with melancholy, which they thought came from too much black bile.
Wow. So bread was like their ancient Prozac or something.
It's an interesting way to think about it.
But aside from health, the book also dives into how different kinds of bread became markers of social class.
Absolutely. What you ate said a lot about your place in society.
Right?
For a long time, rye bread and coarser wheat breads were what the working class in Belgium ate.
Okay.
But as we get closer to the late 1800s, we see this change.
A finer white bread, which had once been a luxury, starts to become more popular.
So why was that? Just a matter of taste.
Taste played a role, but economics was a big factor too.
Okay,
Falling prices made white bread more affordable,
I see.
and it became a symbol of upward mobility.
Yeah, that makes sense.
As people got more economically stable, they could afford to eat whiter bread.
It's amazing how food choices could reflect these larger social trends.
It really is.
But then the book mentions a resurgence of interest in brown bread during the 1980s.
Yeah.
That seems to mirror some of the food trends we're seeing now.
Absolutely. In the 80s, health concerns and a desire for like more flavorful bread,
Okay.
artisan varieties led to this renewed appreciation for brown bread.
Huh.
We see that happening again today.
Yeah.
With things like ancient grains and sourdough.
Like history is repeating itself with our food obsessions.
Exactly.
So we've got bread as a symbol of life, a marker of social status, a reflection of changing tastes.
But let's talk about the people who actually made this all-important food. The bakers.
The bakers.
The book paints a pretty vivid picture of what their lives were like.
Yeah. It wasn't an easy life.
I can imagine.
Long hours, mostly at night in hot, demanding conditions.
Yeah.
All that kneading the dough was intense.
I've tried making sourdough at home.
Yeah.
I can't imagine doing that all day, every day.
No kidding. The book mentions this guide from 1767 by Paul Jacques Malouin. It describes the baker's tools and all the back-breaking work involved.
Oh, wow.
It's no wonder many bakers thought about quitting by the time they were 40.
Man, that puts our complaints about work-life balance into perspective.
I know, right?
And it wasn't just the physical toll, was it?
No.
The book also talks about these sometimes tense relationships between master bakers and their apprentices.
Oh, yeah. It was a complicated dynamic,
Okay.
full of power struggles, pranks, and even accusations of moral danger from the masters.
Moral danger. That's interesting.
Yeah, toward their young apprentices.
It sounds like there was a lot of drama in the bakery.
Yeah, there was.
But this traditional way of baking was bound to change with the arrival of industrialization, wasn't it?
It was, and the book traces that evolution really well.
Okay.
It goes from these small independent shops,
Yeah.
figure 2.2 has a cute illustration of one,
Okay.
to larger mechanized factories. By the 1880s, they could produce bread on a massive scale.
That makes me think of the craft beer movement, but in reverse.
Interesting.
So what led to this shift towards mass production?
A few things. The industrialization of grain production meant cheaper flour,
Okay.
and improvements in transportation made it easier to distribute grain and bread.
So all these separate developments helped fuel this huge change in the bread industry.
Exactly. It shows how interconnected everything is. And as you might expect, not everyone was happy about this shift.
Right.
Some saw it as progress, efficiency, while others worried about the quality of the bread and the loss of the baker's craft.
So that tension between efficiency and tradition is still something we're dealing with today.
Absolutely.
In the middle of all this industrialization, there's one story that really stands out.
What's that?
The story of Voorhout, a socialist bakery in Ghent that tried to do things differently.
Oh, Voorhout.
Their approach to baking seems so ahead of its time.
They were pioneers. They were a cooperative,
Okay.
which means owned and operated by its members.
Okay.
And they had the strong social mission. They weren't just focused on making money.
Okay.
They wanted to use their bakery to improve people's lives, their workers, and the community.
The book mentions their almost obsession with quality control.
Yes, they were meticulous about it.
How so?
Members would actually critique the bread.
Wow.
Their leader, Edward Ansel, tasted the flour himself.
Really?
And they even sent bread samples to labs
To test them.
to test them. That was unheard of at the time.
So they were combining a social mission with this real dedication to quality.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about the bread either. They used their profits to fund other social programs,
Like what?
things like education and healthcare for their members.
It's like a bakery with a built-in social safety net.
It really is a remarkable example
Yeah.
of how bread could be used for social change.
Yeah. But speaking of change, one thing that stood out to me was how touchy the subject of bread prices was.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost like bread prices were an indicator of social stability.
Absolutely. Fluctuations in grain prices, harvests, and government policies had a huge impact on people's lives.
Imagine if food prices were constantly on the news today.
I know, it would be chaos.
The book even mentions bread riots.
Bread riots were a constant throughout history.
Yeah.
When people couldn't afford bread, things could get out of control.
It's a reminder of how essential bread was to people's lives.
It really was. And it wasn't always about bakers being greedy.
Okay.
There were a lot of factors at play.
Like what?
Things like bread assizes, which were basically price controls. They tried to keep bread affordable, but also let bakers make a decent profit.
I see. So it was a tricky balancing act.
It was. And something else that might surprise you.
What's that?
Buying bread on credit was incredibly common.
Really?
Even into the early 1900s, credit wasn't just for big things like houses and cars. It was a way of life, especially when it came to buying bread.
That's fascinating.
It highlights just how important bread was.
It really does. So we've got bread riots, price controls, credit systems, all revolving around this idea of good bread.
Right.
But what exactly was good bread throughout history, and whose job was it to make sure the bread was good?
That's a great question. The idea of good bread changed over time,
Huh?
and so did the role of the authorities in ensuring its quality.
Okay.
At first, the government was mainly focused on regulating trade and protecting the bakers' reputations.
So making sure nobody was selling bad bread and ruining their business.
Exactly. It was about fairness. But as concerns about food safety and adulteration grew,
Yeah.
the government's role became more proactive.
The book mentions this fascinating example. Brussels appoints a chemist in 1856 just to test bread for adulteration.
That's right. It's considered the beginning of modern food regulation.
It's crazy how much we take that for granted now.
I know, right?
You just assume our food is safe.
Yeah.
But it took a lot of work to get to this point.
You're right. It wasn't just about testing for harmful stuff either.
Okay.
There was a growing push to provide dietary advice and promote certain types of bread.
The book even talks about using school textbooks to subtly influence what people ate.
It's an interesting example
Yeah.
of how areas like education could shape the public's perception of food.
Wow, so much history packed into every loaf, and we've only just begun to explore it.
There's so much more to uncover,
It's amazing to think about all the things we take for granted today,
like sliced bread.
like sliced bread. Exactly. Before we jump back in, though,
Right.
it's interesting to consider how all these subtle attempts to influence what people ate were part of a bigger trend. For centuries, bread was like the food in the Belgian diet.
It really was.
They were serious about their carbs. Was there any data on how much they ate?
There was. In the mid-1800s, surveys showed that the average worker ate over a pound of bread every day.
A pound a day.
What?
Wow.
It's a lot of bread.
Did that stay pretty consistent over time?
Interestingly, no. By the late 1800s,
Okay.
that amount actually increased as white bread got cheaper and more available. But then World War I happened.
Yeah, things must changed a lot during the war.
They did. Rationing and food shortages had a huge impact on bread consumption.
Right, of course.
But what's fascinating is that even after the war,
Okay.
bread consumption kept declining.
I wonder why.
People were incorporating more meat and dairy into their diets.
Okay.
And just not relying on bread as their main source of calories anymore.
So it was like bread was slowly losing its place as the king of the Belgian table.
You could say that. And this shift in eating habits really worried the bakers' federations.
Of course. They were seeing their main product being replaced.
Exactly. They knew they had to adapt. They couldn't just compete on price anymore.
So what did they do?
They had to start appealing to people's changing tastes.
So they needed to innovate.
They did. Scholliers calls this the second bread revolution. The revolution of taste.
Okay.
Instead of just basic loaves.
Yeah.
They began to experiment with different flours, shapes, ingredients.
Right.
Appealing to a more sophisticated palate.
It sounds kind of like how we've seen the rise of craft breweries and artisanal food.
It is very similar. It became about more than just filling your stomach.
Right.
It was about rediscovering the art of baking,
Yeah.
offering a wider variety of tasty and interesting breads.
So this shift towards quality and taste wasn't something that happened overnight.
It wasn't. Scholliers traces it back to the late 1800s and early 1900s,
Okay.
when some bakers were already trying out more refined breads.
So even back then, people were looking for something special in their bread.
Absolutely. And this drive to innovate kept going through the 20th century, leading to all the different bread options we have today.
It's amazing to think something as simple as bread has this whole history of innovation.
It is.
But the book also talks about a darker side of the industry.
Right.
This constant anxiety around bread. Not just the price, but its purity.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme. This fear of being cheated or poisoned.
Yeah.
It shows how much people depended on bread for survival.
Makes sense.
Any threat to their bread supply was a threat to their life.
So people were always on edge, worried about bakers cutting corners or tampering with the bread.
Exactly. And this worry showed up in a lot of ways.
Like what?
We talked about bread riots,
Right.
but there were also tons of complaints to the authorities.
Okay.
Rumors spreading in communities and just constant scrutiny of bakers.
So bread wasn't just food. It was also a source of social and economic anxiety.
It really was. What role did the government play in all this?
Well, what did they do about this fear?
The government's role was complicated.
They weren't just regulating prices and trade.
Right.
They were trying to build trust in the food system.
Okay.
The book mentions inspections, confiscations, even public baking tests.
Wow.
It took a lot of effort to reassure people about their bread.
That makes sense. It was all about keeping things stable.
Exactly. Remember, bread was tied to people's sense of security?
And it wasn't just about physical safety either, was it?
No.
It seems like there's this moral dimension to pure bread.
You're right. Adulterated bread wasn't just seen as unhealthy.
Yep.
It was a betrayal, a sign of moral decay in the community.
Wow.
Messing with bread was a serious offense.
It's almost like bread was sacred.
You could say that. It held a special place in society,
Right.
and any attempt to mess with it had serious consequences.
But as technology improved and industrialization continued,
Yeah.
those fears about adulteration didn't just disappear, did they?
No, they didn't. They just changed.
How so?
It shifted from things like chalk or bean flour being added to bread.
To concerns about mechanized milling and chemical additives.
So the technology changed, but the worry about purity stayed the same.
Exactly. And in some ways,
Yeah.
we still see that today. All the debates about natural versus processed foods,
Right.
concerns about what's in our bread.
Yeah.
It's all connected to those centuries of worry.
It's like we're still carrying that baggage of
That's
distrust.
a good point. But I think it's important to remember that amidst all this anxiety,
Yeah.
there's also this story of ingenuity, resilience, and adaptation. The history of bread is ultimately a story of our connection to this amazing food.
I think that's a good way to put it. Scholliers does a great job
Yeah,
showing how bread has been this constant throughout history,
he does.
adapting and evolving right alongside society.
His work reminds us that even something ordinary like bread
Right.
can have such a rich and complex history.
It really makes you think differently about that next slice of bread.
Absolutely. I know I will.
Well, this deep dive has been super interesting.
Yeah.
We've covered so much.
We have.
Bread riots to the revolution of taste.
It's been a journey.
But there's still more to come. You know, we've been focusing a lot on like the big picture stuff.
Yeah.
You know, the social and economic forces shaping bread. But I'm curious about the role of women in all of this?
Oh, that's an important part of the story.
They're often kind of the unsung heroes in the kitchen, right?
They are.
I imagine they played a big role in the bread world, too.
Absolutely. For centuries, women were the main bakers at home.
Okay.
Baking bread was like a core part of their domestic duties, and their skills in the kitchen were seen as a reflection of their worth.
So bread was tied to these ideas of being a good wife and mother.
Exactly. And even as commercial bakeries started popping up, women were still essential.
In what way?
They often worked alongside their husbands,
Okay.
managing the shop, keeping the books, talking to customers.
Really?
They were the backbone of the business.
It's fascinating how they were so vital, but often overlooked.
It is. Scholliers does a great job highlighting their work.
Does he give any specific examples?
He does. He talks about this baker's wife from 1865
Okay.
who ran the entire shop while her husband baked.
Wow.
She handled everything from sales to credit,
Yeah.
all while keeping the shop welcoming for customers.
So running a bakery was a real family affair.
It was. And as the industry changed, so did women's roles.
Right.
With the rise of industrial bakeries,
Yeah.
more women started working in factories,
Okay.
doing things like wrapping and slicing bread.
So the work became more mechanized,
Yeah.
less about traditional skill.
In a way. But even in the factories, women found ways to make their voices heard.
Really? How?
Scholliers mentions a strike by female bakery workers in Brussels in 1924.
Wow.
They demanded better pay and working conditions.
Good for them. It's inspiring to see them fighting for their rights.
It is. It reminds us that the history of bread isn't just about economics and technology.
Right.
It's also a story of women's work, their struggles, their triumphs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Speaking of struggles, though,
Yeah.
I think it's important to acknowledge that Scholliers doesn't shy away from the harder parts of this story.
He doesn't.
He talks about things like exploitation of workers,
Right.
tough conditions in the bakeries, and the challenges people faced trying to make a living.
It's true.
It's a reminder that behind every loaf, there's a human story.
There is.
And not all those stories are happy ones.
That's right. The book highlights the long hours, the low pay,
Yeah.
the dangerous conditions bakers faced, especially in the early industrial days. He also talks about the role of labor unions,
Okay.
fighting for better treatment and workers' rights.
It really makes you realize
Yeah,
that bread is connected to all these bigger issues.
it is.
Class, labor, social justice.
Issues we're still dealing with today.
It's true. It makes you appreciate the complexity of our food
It does.
and the systems that get it to our tables.
Thinking about all the people involved,
Oh.
the bakers, the families, the workers fighting for fairness.
It adds a whole new layer of meaning to something as basic as bread.
I think that's a perfect way to sum it up.
It really is. This deep dive has been fascinating.
It has.
We've explored the history of bread in Belgium,
Yeah.
uncovered stories of changing tastes, social fears, economic ups and downs, and the hard work of so many people.
Men and women.
Bread is clearly so much more than just food.
It is.
It's a reflection of our shared human experience.
Absolutely.
So next time you grab a loaf of bread,
Right?
remember, it's not just about how it tastes.
It's about the history.
It's a story that goes back centuries,
Centuries.
filled with innovation, struggle, and this connection we all have to this essential food.
Beautifully said. It really is. Who knows what the future holds for bread, though?
That's a good question.
Will we keep seeing this return to artisanal methods?
Yeah.
Or will there be new technologies that totally change bread as we know it?
It's hard to say.
One thing's for sure, though. Bread will always be a part of our lives.
I think you're right about that. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the history of bread.
It's been my pleasure.
And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for more captivating deep dives like this one. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.